Thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece, Declassified. Episode 16, Dialogue and Dialectic. This episode will explore the art of the philosophical dialogue, both as a literary form and as a practice between people in real-time conversation. Most of the discussion will revolve in some way or other around the work of the philosopher Plato, since he is widely considered the best writer of philosophical dialogues from ancient Greece, if not of all time. And our guest today, McCabe, is an expert on Plato. You'll probably need to know some basic things about Plato in order to easily follow today's conversation. If you're new to this podcast and you don't know much about Plato, then I would recommend first checking out our episode 8 called Plato Strikes Back, where we give an introduction and overview of Plato's life and times and his contributions to philosophy. In that episode, we spoke to Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, who is probably the only well-known philosopher today who has written her own philosophical dialogues. Most philosophers today publish books that offer a series of arguments supporting some big claim. There are no characters involved, it's just the author saying what he or she thinks. Instead, Goldstein has a few books that take the form of a novel in which different characters have lively debates about pressing issues and impactful ideas. This way of writing philosophy, of dramatizing philosophy, goes way back to the beginnings of philosophical investigation in the 5th century BC, and it has been practiced by philosophers throughout history. A contemporary of Plato named Xenophon also wrote dialogues featuring Socrates as the main character. The Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero wrote all of his philosophical works as dialogues. Erasmus of Rotterdam wrote some. Davide Hume wrote dialogues. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, wrote some. So the dialogue never completely went out of style, but it never became mainstream either. I remember in college, when we had to read Plato's Republic, a lot of kids were saying, why doesn't he just say what he thinks and give his arguments for it? What is this charade? And even most of the professors seemed of the opinion that the dialogue genre is a relic of an earlier stage in philosophy that we've gotten past. So it's cute to read Plato, but that's not how serious philosophy is done today. Nevertheless, the allure of the dialogue persists. There's still a market for them, and a lot of scholars still read Plato not just out of historical curiosity, but out of genuine philosophical interest. So today, we're going to try to figure out what makes a philosophical dialogue good, and what makes a good philosophical dialogue worth your time. What can you get out of it that you wouldn't get out of a straightforward treatise? Our guest is a renowned scholar of Plato and ancient philosophy. McCabe is Professor Emerita at King's College London in philosophy. I caught up with Professor McCabe recently at Princeton University, where she had been invited to give a talk at a conference. Just a quick side note, we had the conversation you're about to hear after she attended 3 days of all-day-long lectures and discussions. Understandably, at the end of this marathon, she was starting to lose her voice. Nevertheless, she graciously sat down with me to have a dialogue on dialogues. Here it is. McCabe, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Most of the scholarly work that you've done over the years has been related in some way or another to Plato.
Yes.
And people outside of the field of philosophy might find it strange that somebody would devote most of their career to a figure that lived so long ago. So what is it about Plato that has kept your attention over your entire career?
It's a very good question. So I think what grabbed me in the beginning is different from what keeps me going, but there's some kind of continuity. So I was educated in Britain, fortunate enough to be at a school where I could learn Greek early. And one of the first things that I read in Greek was Plato's dialogue, composite, dramatic extravaganza, the Symposium. And it's a wonderful story of a drinking party where they don't really do much drinking, but they have a series of conversations about love, and there's a parade of different characters who offer their opinions, and Socrates is, as it were, the high point of the discussion, or so it often seems. And I was completely transfixed by both the ways of thought and the ways of expressing how we think. In the symposium, it's funny. It's never dull. It's light and full of vivid language. And so in the first instance, I was excited about that. Then I discovered some things about philosophy, and I became less interested in the way it was expressed and much more interested in some of the very complicated ideas, especially ideas in what would now be called metaphysics in Plato. Plato is thought to take the view that actually we can understand the world around us by thinking about things that are not in the world around us, but are kind of extra special entities somewhere else. And I found, for some reason, I don't know that I know quite what the reason would be, but I found that proposal exciting and challenging and overturning of the way that I thought that the world must work. One of the things that I think is exciting about some parts of ancient philosophy is the way in which they offer challenges to the way that we think, rather than imperatives, rather than orders about what we should think. Instead, what they do is they say, well, are you sure? How do you know that's the right way to think about it? They're repeated challenges to the ways in which our ordinary, daily carelessnesses of thought work. Ever since I realized or came to think that that's what Plato's engaged with, I've been captivated by it in all sorts of different ways.
Do you think that the dialogue form is conducive to challenging the reader?
At first glance, I think it isn't. You find that if you read a Platonic dialogue, very often there are two people or three people, and there'll be the main character, who's in most cases is Socrates, who asks all the questions and gets all the good lines. And the person he's talking to will sometimes look as if he's just going, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. The skill of the Platonic use of dialogue is that it's not merely a representation or the form in which arguments are put, but instead, the way the representation is done, it makes us recognize that we're the subjects to whom the representation appears. So we look at the representation from the outside, and the conversation actually takes place not between the people in the dialogue, but between Plato and his reader. And that's the brilliance of the way that he does it.
Interesting. So let's get to more of Plato in a minute, but Xenophon is the other side of the story nobody talks about. What about his dialogues? Do they have as much of literary or philosophical merit as Plato's?
I don't think they're philosophical documents at all, really. It's partly because I'm captivated by Plato that I'm not captivated by Xenophon. The impression I get from Xenophon is that what you have here is Socrates as a sort of moral paradigm who's saying the right things, doing the right things, having lots of conversations with the people he meets, for sure. But there isn't a deep or radical challenge to the ways we think that's mounted by Xenophon, whereas the Platonic dialogues, every dialogue mounts a challenge to the ways we think and the conventional ways in which we deploy our assumptions.
So why do Xenophon and Plato both use Socrates as their protagonist in these dialogues?
It looks as if it's kind of obvious to us from here, Socrates was this extraordinary figure, and there were lots of other people. I mean, we have some evidence that there were other people who were doing the same thing, who were writing these Socratic discourses. So it wasn't just these two.
So there was a kind of fan fiction?
It was maybe that's right. It's puzzling. Well, maybe it's not puzzling. Maybe the thought is this. Maybe it's very tempting in difficult times to think that you found a moral hero. And they were very difficult times, because these things are being written after the death of Socrates in the following century, when there was huge amounts of unrest of various kinds. And maybe that's what we do in times of crisis. I'm not convinced that Plato takes Socrates to be a moral hero at all, but I think Xenophon does. And I find that rather kind of dull.
Interesting. So why would Plato choose to write philosophical dialogues in the first place and not a single just treatise? Just like, here's what I think, these are my arguments, I'm going to try to just persuade you about these points.
The boring answer to that, I suppose, first is that there wasn't a sort of representative way of doing philosophy. So there were some people before him who had written long poems. So Parmenides, who wrote a long poem. So there wasn't a kind of canonical form anyway. I don't imagine that Plato sat down and said, oh gosh, I need to write philosophy. Shall I write a treatise or shall I write a dialogue? I don't think that was quite how it looked. The thing that I think Plato got right about it was that he made the dialogues manifestly demanding of an interpretation. So it's not just like looking at a television program and identifying with the figures in the television program. You're always at a distance, and the distance that he puts his reader at makes you critical. And I think it's only the dialogue form that can do that, because you have this extraordinary movement between the characters.
Interesting. So in terms of teaching practices, I think that we can all agree that if you have a teacher who teaches you through question and answer one-on-one, that is just undeniably more effective than having a lecturer stand before you and give you a lecture.
Yes, I think that's right.
That's why we have tutors. And if we had a world where every single student had a private tutor, students would learn a lot more. Now, does that translate, however, into the question of genre? Like, is the dialogue in any way an emulation of the question and answer form of teaching that sets it apart from a treatise, which is in a sense an emulation of the lecture?
I think that's a really good question. You might think that it isn't. So when you read some of the dialogues, and Socrates has all the good words, and the person he's talking to says yes, no, and every so often gets into a muddle and goes, I don't know. You might think that that's not telling us anything much at all. I think that if you can take a step back from that and think about how question and answer works, the way that the representation of question and answer works, it does several things that really matter. One of the things that it does is it makes us pay attention to the ways in which answers are related to questions. And that's not just, oh, well, here's a question and there's the answer to it. Once you think about answers related to questions, you're thinking about explanatory structures, for example. Once you think about one question and an answer and then the next question and the next answer, you're thinking about sequences of explanation or logical sequence very often. And what question and answer can do, again with this reflective feature that I've suggested the dialogues have, which is to make the reader always notice that the reader is at a distance from it, is to make you think about those kinds of argumentative, explanatory shapes and structures. It's always about answering the question why.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you mentioned that there are some passages where it's basically Socrates asking questions and then the interlocutor saying, yes, Socrates, well, of course, Socrates, well, yeah, Socrates. But there also are characters with strong opinions, strong arguments, and intense personalities. So do you think that Plato was fair in representing these famous opponents of Socrates? Or did he kind of give them watered down versions of their doctrines that Socrates could easily knock down?
A lot of people find that that's what they think is going on. And I think that's not right. I think that two of the obvious characters are the figure of Callicles in Plato's Gorgias, who in a dialogue that's about rhetoric and power and justice, towards the end of the dialogue you get this figure of Callicles who's a violent opponent of what Socrates is saying. Writ large, he's an immoralist. He thinks that it's not just perfectly okay to take other people's stuff or exercise power, but that it's even a requirement on us that if we're strong, we ought to take what other people have.
So he's like the Wolf of Wall Street.
Right. Is that right? I'm sorry, I don't know. Is he?
Well, you'd be surprised how many of my friends who work in finance love Callicles' argument.
Callicles. Yeah. So I think the figure of Callicles seems to me to be an important figure in the structure of reasoning about moral principle. You might think that sometimes the arguments that Socrates offers against him are less strong than they should be, and tu ad hominem. I think that's less true in the case of Callicles than in the case of his counterpart Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic, where Thrasymachus just takes the view that that you can take it if you want. From other people you can take what you want, and that's okay.
He's a similar figure overall.
He's a similar figure, and he's interested in a conception of justice on which the person who's stronger is immune to the constraints of justice which are imposed on him by the weak. That's the Thrasymachus view. And the arguments that Thrasymachus is given are not well maintained by him in the drama of the dialogue. And often people say it makes a nonsense of the position and the opposition to it. But the whole of the Republic is the answer, not the answers that you find in the narrow context where you read the responses to Thrasymachus. So I think the poverty of the answers to Thrasymachus at the beginning of the Republic are meant to be noticeable. They're meant to make us say, hang on a minute, this isn't a decisive answer to this chap. Because at the beginning of the next book of the Republic, some other people come along who just happen to be Plato's brothers in the fiction of the dialogue, and they come along and they say, hang on, let's try and think about this argument again. And they think very deeply and utterly, radically about the answers to the questions about why be just.
That's fascinating. So, to quote one of your well-known sayings, Plato does nothing in vain. So
Absolutely.
If he does give less than ideal arguments to an interlocutor, it usually has a higher purpose.
That's what I think. It's not a kind of cheat or a con.
So how did Plato publish these dialogues? Do we know how big an audience he could have reached?
Presumably the audience in ancient Athens was pretty limited. And sometimes that encourages one to think that these things were elite documents which were designed simply to reinforce the views of the Athenian elite at the time. There's a dialogue by Plato called the Phaedrus, and at one point in this dialogue there's a puzzle raised about writing, and the puzzle goes something like this. Look, there's a problem about writing things down, because once you write an argument or a thesis down, it can never defend itself. All it does is, as Socrates puts it then, is roll around. It can't argue back. And one of the problems, as it's put there, about books is that books can't engage in question and answer. The interesting thing about the passage is that that's written in a book. So the paradox of it's being written in a book, in my view, is fundamental to how we think about what Plato thought about his audience. So although I think it's true that his proximate audience, his immediate audience, were the small number of people who could read or listen to the things that he was writing, if it was read out loud or if it was something that somebody who could read for themselves. His target is anybody. And the book paradox makes it clear, I think, that what he has in mind is making written works that will, after all, satisfy the book paradox, that they will, after all, be able to give you a conversation that you can have, whoever you are. So I think he wrote it not just for his contemporaries, but for us as well.
A possession for all time?
Absolutely.
One skill that Plato mentions throughout the dialogues is dialectic. Now, if you read modern philosophy, when the term dialectic comes up, it sounds like something really complicated. But what did Plato mean by dialectic?
I think he invents it. I think that's the first thing to say. So he starts out by talking about conversation. And the Greek word for conversation is dialegesthai. And in the Republic, one of the things that Socrates is interested in exploring is the idea that the to and fro of conversation is something that matters. And that then is developed in the Republic by means of two moves. One of them is that having a conversation together is thought of as the giving and taking of reasons, where it's important to the idea of giving and taking of reasons that you don't just give but take. And he takes that to be a fundamental feature of the way that we should think. It's an important condition on proper thinking. As he develops that idea, he comes to be able to think of it as something like an art. Now, there are other people who are practicing this kind of thing. There are people who are, Protagoras, for one, is talking about this kind of thing too. Plato starts by thinking it's a conversation and then ends up into using the word dialectic for the perfected art of doing philosophy.
Interesting. Is it fair to say that dialectic is the method of discussing philosophically that optimizes the productivity of the discussion?
I think that's what he thinks. There are two ways of glossing what he thinks when he thinks that. One of them is that he thinks that in the best case, we need two actual people. So that the best kind of conversation is a real conversation in real time between two actual people, exchanging different views and being accountable to each other. A second view is that he thinks that the reason that that's the right way to do philosophy out loud is that, in fact, he has a theory about the way that we think, which is that we think in this to and fro way that looks like a conversation. I think, so it's controversial whether he thought that real conversations are the most important thing or whether internal conversations are the most important thing. For my money, the real ones are the most important thing, not least because that is where the notion of accountability becomes so important.
Interesting. Because we live at a time when it's increasingly difficult to have civil discussions across different ideologies and belief systems. Do you think there is something we can learn from the ancient art of dialectic to facilitate having civil and productive conversations today?
I think there is. I think perhaps one of the things that we need to remember is that civility is fine when you have equality. But in situations where there is no equality, civility is either a sham or it doesn't exist. And it's very important, it seems to me, that we should be able also to say that there are important moral emotions involved in being accountable to each other that are not just a matter of manners.
Well, that's interesting. But there are some vicious feelings among equals today.
Yes.
Political equals.
Yes.
So when you have a polarized situation like you do in many Western countries today, where you have millions of people on each side thinking that the millions of people on the other side are just hopelessly wrong and bad, right? Is there any role that logic and dialectic can play in healing that divide? Because this is an issue that Plato and Xenophon also face.
Yes, yes. Yes, up to a point, of course. But you need the common ground to have the logic accepted. So if you say, oh, well, your argument's got a fallacy in it, to somebody who's outside the bubble that you're in and in a bubble of their own, they can't hear it, and indeed they will take it to be an act of aggression. Mm-hmm. And I think that, to return to the thought that actually what we need to be doing is thinking about arguments in the context of a conversation between people. Mm-hmm. You can't separate out the logical features of the argument from the ethical features of the argument in a crisis. And the crisis that we're in is one that is a moral crisis rather than an argumentative one. So the argument is probably not going to fix it for us. It may help, but it's not going to be enough.
Interesting. To go back to Xenophon's Socrates, one of the things that the Stoic philosophers later admired about Socrates as portrayed by Xenophon is how he was able to settle disputes and differences. Like, I think it's either Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius says, do all that you can to end disputes among people, and just read Xenophon's Symposium and see how many people Socrates reconciled with each other.
Right, that's interesting, because I think, so if you think about what I was suggesting about the moral standing of Socrates in Xenophon, that goes to the same point, I think, that you can't, in times of crisis in particular, or in times when reconciliation is what's needed, you can't do it with the rules of argument alone. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is what Plato understood.
So you need some charm, status, and goodwill.
Well, you need, I do think it begins with how we think of ourselves as accountable to others. Not in a political sense so much as in a personal sense. And I think that both the acknowledgement that we're accountable and the acknowledgement that somebody else is such as to require an account from us is the place to begin.
That's interesting. Speaking of issues like equality and accountability, are all characters in Plato's dialogues citizen males?
No. No, there's a range of characters. I mean, some of them, mostly for sure, they're male and such as to be citizens in some plays. The exception, well, there are two exceptions. One of them is in a dialogue that's in any case disputed, the Menexenus, where Aspasia, who was the courtesan companion of Pericles, appears to be engaged in the dialogue. But that's perhaps an outrider. Mm-hmm. The central case is the strange case of the Symposium, where you have a woman priestess whose name is Diotima, who herself takes Socrates to task for Socrates' inadequacies and elaborates an extraordinary view of the nature of beauty and the nature of love.
Those are both fascinating examples. In the case of Aspasia, it's mentioned in the dialogue, the Menexenus, that she wrote Pericles' famous speeches, so she's portrayed as like his secret weapon. Right. And Diotima has arguably one of the greatest philosophical expositions anywhere in Plato. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if Plato, instead of using the characters of Diotima and Aspasia, if he had just substituted those characters with male citizens of Athens, would that change the meaning or the message or the effect of the dialogue?
So I think it cuts in two ways. I think, yes, it would, because what those particular instances do is they give you a sense that actually it doesn't matter who Socrates talks to. And Socrates himself, on occasions, will say, I'll talk to anybody. So they kind of represent that. But in a way, we maybe shouldn't be too hung up on whether those who we think now should be represented are represented or not. Because we shouldn't be hung up on thinking, I think, that representation is the core of this business. So if I'm right in thinking that it's the engagement between the representation and the audience, then the question gets sidestepped, because actually all we're seeing is a whole series of different dramatic moves, each of which is designed to provoke. You get more provocation because Diotima is there, for sure. But she doesn't stand in for the thought that women are fine in these contexts, or that they're not fine in these contexts.
Interesting. So in the 2,400 years since Plato, many philosophers have written dialogues. Do you have a favorite?
Not really. I mean, a lot of them are so dull.
So you think nobody has achieved the dramatic
I don't think anybody
flair?
But I think that's partly because it's not quite about dramatic flair. I mean, I think that it's because it's about something much more complicated that maybe sometimes, that if you think about Berkeley's dialogues, that you get the opposite points of view being represented, but it doesn't do all of this extra stuff. I think one of the things that's often missing from these later works is that they're not very funny. One of the things that it's important not to forget about Plato is that he's funny.
I would agree with that, but not a very common opinion.
Well, I challenge anybody to read the dialogue called the Euthydemus and not think that Plato is funny.
See, that's interesting, because I think that there's a lot of TV personalities today that resemble Euthydemus, in the sense these are like these intellectual bullies that ask you questions that don't have a clear yes or no answer, but they force you into answering yes or no, and then they lead you into a position that you cannot defend.
A position also that makes you look foolish.
Exactly.
So again, it's a dialogue that's got this moral and attitudinal content, but it's done with these bizarre arguments. But a lot of it is very funny. A lot of that is very funny, I think.
Maybe if we taught Euthydemus in every high school, many of these cable news figures would lose their jobs.
That might be right. That's a good idea. Yeah, like that idea. They end up. What the conclusion of the Euthydemus is that this kind of logic chopping argument sews up everybody's mouths, including their own. So the argument against this kind of approach is that it silences everybody.
Exactly. Well, what about today? Do you think that we'll see a comeback of the philosophical dialogue in academic contexts anytime soon?
I hope we might see not that so much as better attention to how we do the subject. I think that's coming. I think one of the things that dialogue seeks to prevent is the damage of the smartness competition. It's collaborative, not competitive. That's what philosophy needs.
Well, let me ask you a more pointed question. At the time of this conversation, you've just given a talk at a conference where several other philosophers also gave talks, and the format at this conference, just as in almost all humanities conferences, is that the papers are circulated in advance. Attendees are expected to read the papers, and then the authors of the papers usually just read the paper at the conference. Now, to your credit, you didn't read yours. You kind of gave your own extemporaneous argument for it, which I think was appreciated. But isn't this system kind of inefficient, where people just read a paper to an audience that has already read the paper, and then after half an hour people ask questions? Like, couldn't we have more of a dialogue in those contexts?
Possibly, but there is a difficulty. I mean, one of the great things about this conference that we've just had is that the sessions were really long in order to include both the reading of the papers, the commentary on the papers, and the questions. But for each session there was at least an hour of discussion. One of the things that's very difficult is to set up the discussion cold without something in advance. So that's the real problem, I think. That maybe it is inefficient.
Yeah.
Often people don't read the papers beforehand. They're supposed to, but they don't, or they don't, it helps them to read it for the second time. And some of this material is very difficult, so it needs doing twice. But the crucial thing is that the discussion, this last 24 hours or so, the discussions have been wonderful.
Sure, but so in the sciences, right, scientists are always shocked to see humanities conferences, because in the sciences, if you're a mathematician or a physicist and you give a talk, it's as complex and lengthy as any humanities talk, but these people are expected to just stand up and be able to recreate the argument on the spot, right? And people can interrupt them and ask questions while they're doing it. So instead of having a prepared paper and then a prepared response by fellow academic and then questions, why not just say, you know what, come here and make your case, and people can interrupt you and ask you questions, of course with a moderator to make it efficient. Why not have that?
Well, because I think perhaps, I think that would turn into, in some of the humanities disciplines, would turn into a kind of gladiatorial contest, and I think that's not what it should be. I think that we have enough problems in philosophy with the idea that there are sort of great minds and then acolytes, without having processes that encourage it. So I remember as a young academic, first starting out, taking logic classes, because my first degrees were in classics, taking logic classes from one of the great American logicians, Quine. And it was a requirement for lots of people. And he was old. It was a wonderful logic class, but the kids who were taking it for a requirement spent the whole class trying to catch him out. And it was so pointless. The catching out, you end up making that the thing that matters most. And I think it isn't. I think understanding is what matters most. So however we get it, sometimes it's really slow. Sometimes it's something you have to go round and round and round, and there's nothing to be gained by requiring people to be quick on their feet, if what that means is that what they say, especially perhaps in a humanities context, is trivial or just smart rather than deep. So that's my answer.
McCabe, thank you very much for coming on the show.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
A couple of announcements before we close today's episode. I'm feeling very grateful because Ancient Greece Declassified has received its first ever donations, unsolicited. A couple of weeks ago, Jeff Wright, host of the Trojan War podcast, who, by the way, has done a lot to support new indie podcasters, gave a donation to this show. So thank you, Jeff. And by the way, if you haven't yet discovered the Trojan War podcast, you're in for a treat. That show has entertained me on many walks and commutes. Then, a few days later, we got a beautiful email from a listener who enjoys the podcast with his family, and he offered a generous gift of support to help us keep the project going. So thank you very much to Scott Griffith, Usaima El-Miski, and Keenan El-Miski for your support. Your gift has greatly eased the cost of maintaining this podcast. And thanks to you, I've been able to purchase a number of books that will come in really handy for future episodes. We've never asked for donations, but I am really moved by the fact that people are enjoying this show enough that they want to help keep it going. Some of you have suggested that we start a Patreon where we can maybe post some bonus content for you. We're considering that. I'll let you know if we do. In the meantime, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your phone so that new episodes come straight to you, and connect with us on Twitter @GreasePodcast or Facebook.com/GreasePodcast, where you can give feedback and request topics for us to cover in the future. Thanks for listening to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Can you still sing Orpheus? Then sing something that's going to last. 1,000 years slips by so fast, goes off into a dusty myth with you.